The scratching didn't start as a threat. It was a pathetic, rhythmic scraping against oak, half drowned by the howling blizzard. Then came the whines. Then the weight of 30 massive bodies pressing against the timber. She gripped her iron poker, unaware the monster bleeding on her porch wore a crown. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the span of an hour. Gwen felt it in the marrow of her bones before the first flake even hit the frozen mud. She stood by the single glazed window of her cabin, pushing a rag into the drafty corner of the frame. Her knuckles were split from chopping cordwood, the skin red and raw. She smeared a paste of dried clay and pine sap over the rag, pressing it hard against the rotting sill. It smelled intensely of turpentine and wet earth. Outside, the sky wasn't just dark, it was the bruised, heavy purple of a swollen eye. The timberline, usually a jagged spine of black pines against the horizon, was entirely swallowed by a moving wall of white. Gwen wiped her hands on her wool trousers. She was an omega, but not the kind the old wives told stories about. There was no delicate fragility to her, no soft, subservient nature that made the alphas in the southern packs lose their minds. She was 26, angular, quiet, and deeply cynical. When her birth pack had tried to marry her off to a violent beta to settle a territorial dispute, she hadn't wept. She had simply packed a canvas bag with dried meat, stolen a good hunting knife, and walked north until the scent of her pack faded into the icy wind. She lived in a repurposed trapper's shack on the edge of the Ironwood territory. Nobody bothered her because nobody wanted to be this far north. The soil was dead, the game was sparse, and the winters killed the unprepared, with indifferent efficiency. Gwen dragged a heavy log from her dwindling indoor pile and dropped it onto the hearth. The fire spat orange embers onto the stone. She nudged the log with the toe of her boot, watching the flames curl around the dry bark. She had enough wood to last 3 days if she kept the fire low. If the storm lasted 4, she would freeze. It was simple math. There was no room for panic. Panic burned calories. The wind hit the cabin like a physical blow. The walls groaned. The tin roof rattled violently, a deafening clatter that made Gwen flinch. Dust sifted down from the rafters, coating the rough-hewn table. Then came the snow. It didn't fall. It drove sideways, scouring the log walls like sand over glass. Gwen pulled a heavy wool blanket from her cot, wrapped it around her shoulders, and sat in the rocking chair by the hearth. She pulled her knees to her chest. The silence inside the cabin was heavy, contrasting the chaotic roar outside. She closed her eyes, listening to the logs pop and hiss. Then she heard it. It was faint at first. Scritch, scrape. Gwen opened her eyes. She stared at the heavy oak door. She held her breath, listening past the wind. Scrape, thud. It was low, near the bottom of the door. A stray raccoon, a starving lynx, then came a heavy, muted thump. The door rattled in its frame. The iron latch clinked. Gwen stood up. The blanket slipped from her shoulders, pooling on the floorboards. She walked slowly toward the door, her thick wool socks making no sound. She placed her bare palm against the frozen oak. The wood vibrated. Something exhaled on the other side. A wet, rattling breath that pushed through the tiny gap between the floor and the door sweep. The smell hit her instantly: wet fur, freezing mud, and the sharp, undeniable metallic tang of blood. Wolf. Her heart kicked against her ribs. One wolf was manageable. One wolf out in this storm was either dead or desperate. But then another thud hit the door, higher this time. Then a scrape against the wall to her left. Then another thump to her right. Whine. It was a chorus of them. High-pitched, desperate, shivering sounds. Gwen backed away from the door. She grabbed the heavy iron fire poker from the hearth. It was solid, blackened, ending in a vicious hook. Her hands were sweating despite the freezing draft. The noise escalated. It wasn't an attack. It was a siege of sheer desperation. Claws tore at the wood, stripping the bark. Bodies slammed against the heavy oak, not trying to break it down, but trying to press closer to the heat seeping through the cracks. The cabin shuddered under the collective weight. 5, 10, 20. The scents layered over one another in her mind. It was a massive pack. Crack! Gwen jumped. The top hinge of the door groaned. The wood around the iron screws was splintering. 30 wolves pressing their combined weight against a century-old door. No, 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 she muttered, gripping the poker tighter. If the door fell outward, she was dead. She wouldn't be able to lift it back into place against the wind and the bodies. The snow would fill the cabin in minutes. The fire would die. She would freeze to death clutching an iron stick. The wood gave another sickening times crack. She had a terrible, cynical thought. It was a choice between freezing to death with certainty or taking her chances with a pack of freezing wolves. She knew wolves. She knew their instincts. In weather like this, the cold was a bigger predator than anything else. Gwen moved to the door. Her hands shook as she grabbed the heavy iron bolt. "Get back!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She slammed the poker against the door. "Get back!" The scraping paused for a fraction of a second. Gwen threw the bolt back and yanked the door inward. The wind screamed into the cabin, bringing a tidal wave of blinding white snow and dark, heavy bodies. Gwen threw her entire body weight behind the door the second the pack surged forward, pinning herself behind the oak as the wolves spilled into her home. They didn't lunge for her. They didn't even look at her. They poured over the threshold in a frantic, limping mass of frostbitten fur and shivering muscle. Gwen gritted her teeth, her boots slipping on the snow-covered floorboards as she fought against the wind. The door was incredibly heavy, fighting her, catching the gale like a sail. With a final, agonizing heave, she slammed it shut. The iron bolt slid home with a sharp times clack. The silence that followed was suffocating. Gwen leaned against the door, her chest heaving. The iron poker held defensively across her body. Her single-room cabin was entirely occupied. 30 wolves. They filled every available square inch of floor space, from the foot of her cot to the edge of the hearth. The smell was overpowering. It was the stench of a wet kennel, rotting pine needles, and stale sweat. But beneath that was something worse. The sharp, sour odor of infection and fresh blood. These weren't local strays. They were massive, even huddled and shivering. The sheer size of them made Gwen's stomach drop. Some were ash gray, others mottled brown, but they all bore the heavy, thick-muscled builds of war-bred wolves. And they were torn to pieces. A silver female near the table was missing half her ear, the wound crusted with black ice. A scarred brown male lay curled near her boots, his hind leg twisted at a sickening angle. They were whimpering, licking their wounds, pressing their bodies together in a dense, steaming pile of fur to share body heat. Gwen didn't move. She stood, plastered against the door, her knuckles white around the poker. She was an Omega. Every instinct in her blood screamed at her to drop her eyes, to make herself small, to submit to the overwhelming, predatory energy in the room. But she was also a realist. Submitting didn't keep you alive in the north. A low rumble started from the center of the mass. The pile shifted. The wolves parted, whining softly, pressing themselves against the walls and furniture to make way. From the center of the pack rose a wolf that made the others look like pups. He was pitch black, a void in the dim light of the cabin, save for the silver frost clinging to his muzzle and the thick ruff of his neck. He didn't whine. He didn't shiver. He stood slowly, his massive paws leaving bloody prints on the floorboards. A deep, ragged gouge ran down his left flank, the flesh torn open to the muscle. He was bleeding out. He turned his massive head toward Gwen. His eyes were gold, not the flat, instinctual yellow of a feral beast, but a deep, intelligent, crushing gold. It was a gaze that carried weight. It physically pressed against her, making it hard to draw breath. Alpha. Not just an alpha. The absolute, suffocating pressure radiating from him meant something much worse. Gwen swallowed hard, refusing to break eye contact, though her chin trembled. "I don't have enough meat," she said, her voice sounding thin and pathetic in the cramped space. "And if you eat me, you won't know how to keep the fire going." The black wolf stared at her. He blinked slowly. Then, his legs gave out. He collapsed onto the floorboards with a heavy thud, his chest heaving irregularly. The other wolves immediately whined, a few crawling forward to nudge his snout with theirs. He let out a low, warning growl, and they backed off, flattening their ears. Gwen watched him bleed onto her clean floor. The cynical voice in her head told her to let him die. An alpha, this strong, traveling with a battered warband, brought nothing but trouble. If whoever did that to him was following his trail, her cabin would be reduced to ash by morning. But he was dying on her floor. And an Omega's base nature, however suppressed, curled around the idea of a wounded pack. She lowered the poker. She didn't put it down, but she let the tip rest against the floorboards. She stepped over a sleeping brown wolf, moving cautiously toward her small kitchen counter. She grabbed an old tin bucket, filled it from the ceramic water jug she kept covered by the window, and grabbed a stack of clean rags. She walked toward the black wolf. The pack tensed, 30 pairs of eyes locked onto her. Low growls vibrated through the floorboards. "Do." Gwen stopped. She looked at the silver female nearest to her. "I'm giving him water." "Shut up!" The female blinked, startled by the sheer audacity or the lack of scent fear, and lowered her head. Gwen knelt a few feet from the massive black wolf. He was watching her. The gold eyes tracked her every movement. "You're bleeding out," she said matter-of-factly, setting the bucket down. "I'm going to clean it. If you bite my hand off, I will brain you with this poker and throw you back into the snow." The wolf exhaled, a long puff of white steam from his nostrils, and closed his eyes. It was as close to a concession as she was going to get. The cabin grew stiflingly hot as 30 massive bodies thawed out. The snow melting from their fur created puddles on the wood, mixing with the dirt and blood to form a grim sludge. Gwen ignored it. She sat cross-legged near the hearth, carefully wiping the gash on the black wolf's side with a damp rag. The wound was jagged. It wasn't a clean blade cut. It was a tear from claws. Another alpha. She pressed the rag against the deepest part of the wound to stem the bleeding. The wolf's muscles twitched violently under her hands. The heat radiating off his body was unnatural, burning through her thick wool trousers. "Hold still," she muttered, rinsing the bloody rag in the bucket. The water was already pink. The wolf's breathing hitched. A deep, bone-rattling shudder worked its way through his massive frame. His spine arched awkwardly. Gwen scrambled backward, dragging the bucket with her. She knew what that shudder meant. The pack agitated, shifting nervously, whining as they pressed themselves further back into the corners of the room. The air in the cabin cracked, literally cracked. The sound of shifting was never as graceful as the poets claimed. It was grotesque. It was the sound of bones breaking and reforming, of cartilage snapping, of fur receding into skin that stretched and tore. Gwen pressed her back against the rough bark of her firewood pile, watching in a mix of horror and clinical fascination. The wolf's massive form contorted. The black fur melted away, revealing pale, scarred skin. The hind legs elongated, the joints popping loudly over the howl of the wind outside. Shoulders broadened, the spine snapping into a rigid, upright posture. It took less than 30 seconds, but it felt like an hour. When the panting stopped, there was no wolf. Lying on the floorboards, entirely naked and slick with sweat and blood, was a man. He was huge. His shoulders were impossibly broad, roped with thick, functional muscle that bore the silver, faded lines of dozens of old battles. His dark hair was plastered to his forehead. He lay on his side, his arm wrapped around his bleeding ribs, gasping for air. But it wasn't his size that made Gwen's breath catch in her throat. It was his left shoulder. Stamped into the skin, dark and undeniable, was an ink tattoo of twin axes crossed over a wolf's skull. Gwen dropped the bloody rag. It hit the floor with a wet slap. The twin axes, the high crown, the mark of the northern sovereign. She had let Gideon into her house, the Alpha King, the man who had supposedly united the fractured territories through sheer, brutal force. The man, rumors said, killed his own uncle with his bare hands to take the throne. He groaned, rolling onto his back. He threw an arm over his eyes, shielding them from the firelight. His chest heaved. "Water," he rasped. His voice sounded like grinding stones. Gwen didn't move. She stared at him. Her mind raced. If the king was here, bleeding on the floor of a trapper's shack, it meant the capital had fallen. It meant the war bands surrounding him were the remnants of the royal guard. It meant whoever did this to him had an army. "I said," he grunted, lowering his arm to glare at her with those heavy gold eyes. "Water." Gwen's jaw tightened. She hated that tone. The entitled, absolute command of an alpha. She stood up slowly, her knees popping. She walked over to the bucket, grabbed the clean tin cup she used for drinking, and dipped it into the fresh water jug. She walked back to him, but she didn't kneel. She stood over him, holding the cup. "You're tracking mud on my floor, Your Majesty," she said, her voice dripping with dry sarcasm. Gideon stared up at her. For a moment, the pain in his eyes was eclipsed by sheer confusion. He looked at her plain clothes, her scarred hands, the complete lack of deference in her posture. He flared his scent, a sharp, oppressive wave of pine, smoke, and dominating ozone meant to force her to her knees. Gwen felt the pressure. Her knees trembled. Her Omega instincts screamed at her to drop, to bare her neck, to apologize. But she had spent 6 years freezing in the woods to unlearn that obedience. She locked her joints. She gritted her teeth. She held the cup steady. "Drink it or don't," she said, her voice tight but unwavering. "But if you try to alpha command me in my own house again, I'll pour it on the fire." Gideon's eyes narrowed. The corners of his mouth twitched, pulling at a scar that ran through his lower lip. With a grunt of pain, he propped himself up on one elbow. He reached out with a large, blood-stained hand and took the cup from her. He drained it in one swallow, his throat working. He handed the cup back. "What are you?" he asked, his voice low, assessing. "I'm the person whose door you just ruined," Gwen replied, turning her back on him to toss the cup onto the counter. "And unless you want to bleed out before the storm breaks, you're going to need stitches." She walked over to her sewing tin on the shelf. She didn't look at him, but she felt his eyes on her. Heavy, calculating. "You're an Omega," Gideon stated. It wasn't a question. He could smell it. The soft, underlying sweetness beneath the scent of wood smoke and dirt. "Astute," Gwen said, pulling a thick iron needle and a spool of linen thread from the tin. She struck a match against the stone fireplace and held the needle to the flame to sterilize it. "Omegas don't live alone," he said, shifting his weight. He winced, a sharp hiss escaping his teeth as the movement pulled at his side. "They don't survive alone." "Evidently they do," Gwen said, walking back to him. She knelt beside him, uncorking a small bottle of clear, terrible-smelling moonshine she used for cleaning wounds. Kings, on the other hand, seemed to need 30 bodyguards just to get their ass kicked. Gideon let out a short, barking laugh that immediately turned into a cough of pain. He looked at her, really looked at her. There was no fear in her eyes, just annoyance and a weary practicality. "Pour the alcohol," the king said quietly, resting his head back against the floorboards. "And try not to enjoy it too much." "No promises," Gwen said, and upended the bottle. The needle pierced the skin with a sickening, wet pop. Gwen didn't flinch. She pulled the thick linen thread through, feeling the resistance of the heavy muscle underneath. Gideon's flesh was unnaturally dense, like trying to sew through a saddle. She tied off the first stitch, her knuckles brushing against the hot, feverish skin of his abdomen. He didn't make a sound. The only indication that he felt anything at all was the sudden, rigid locking of his jaw and the flare of his nostrils. "Don't hold your breath," Gwen muttered, snipping the thread with a pair of rusted shears. "It makes the muscle tense." Makes my job harder. Gideon exhaled slowly. The breath washed over her face, smelling of copper and exhaustion. He turned his head to watch her. The gold in his eyes was muted now, clouded by pain and blood loss, but the intensity remained. It was the gaze of a man accustomed to dissecting a room and everyone in it within seconds. "You have the hands of a butcher," he grated out, his voice hoarse. "And you have the survival instincts of a lemming." She shot back, threading the needle again. "Lie still." She drove the iron needle in for the second stitch. He grunted, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to echo in the small space. Around them, the pack shifted uneasily. The smell in the cabin was evolving. The wet dog stench was fading, replaced by the heavy, suffocating musk of 30 apex predators crammed into 200 square feet. "How long have you lived out here?" Gideon asked. He was trying to distract himself. She could tell by the way his hands gripped the edge of the floorboards, his knuckles turning white. 6 winters, Gwen answered. She wiped a line of fresh blood away with the rag. Long enough to know that a pack this size moving through the Ironwood territory means the southern passes are blocked. Gideon's eyes narrowed slightly. "You pay attention to troop movements from a trapper's shack?" "I pay attention to anything that might come and eat my winter stores," she corrected. "And judging by the state of your guard, whoever you were fighting didn't just push you back. They routed you." The silence that followed was heavier than the blizzard outside. The wind slammed against the tin roof, rattling the rafters. But inside the cabin, the tension was absolute. A few of the wolves near the hearth let out low, warning growls. Gideon raised a hand, a sharp, cutting motion. The growls ceased instantly. "My brother," Gideon said quietly. The words tasted like ash in the small room. "He brokered a deal with the coastal packs. They hit us during the solstice feast. Poison in the meat, silver in the wine. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution." Gwen paused. She looked at the jagged tear in his side. She had assumed rival alphas, a territorial dispute. She hadn't considered a coup. The cynicism in her chest tightened into something resembling pity, but she squashed it immediately. Pity didn't keep the fire burning. "Well?" Gwen said, pulling the thread tight on the final stitch. He clearly missed. She tied off the knot and sat back on her heels, wiping her bloody hands on a relatively clean patch of her trousers. She grabbed the bottle of moonshine and poured a liberal amount directly over the closed wound. Gideon violently arched off the floor, a strangled, guttural roar tearing from his throat. His massive hand shot out, wrapping around Gwen's wrist like a vice. His grip was bone-crushing. The gold in his eyes flared, wild and predatory, as the searing pain of the alcohol ate into his raw nerves. Gwen didn't pull away. She couldn't if she tried. She looked down at the massive hand encircling her arm. Then, up into his frantic, furious eyes. "Let go of me," she said. Her voice was entirely devoid of panic. It was a flat, unyielding demand. They stared at each other. The air crackled with dominant energy. He was projecting his alpha command, an instinctual reaction to pain, trying to force her to submit, to cower, to soothe him. Gwen felt it pressing against her skull, a heavy, throbbing pressure that made her eyes water, but she held her ground. She met his gaze, her expression locked in stubborn defiance. Slowly, the wildness in Gideon's eyes receded. The heavy pressure in the room dissipated, leaving the air tasting faintly of ozone. His grip loosened, and his hand fell heavily back to the floorboards. He let out a long, ragged sigh, closing his eyes. "My apologies," he whispered. Gwen rubbed her wrist. "It would bruise." "Put a shirt on," she told him, standing up, "or at least a blanket. You're bleeding on my floor, and I'm not running a bathhouse." She walked over to her cot and stripped off the heavy wool blanket, tossing it across the room. It landed squarely on Gideon's chest. From the corner of the room, near the small kitchen counter, one of the wolves began to shift. The sound of breaking bones and reforming cartilage filled the cabin once more. Gwen kept her back turned, aggressively organizing her meager tin of medical supplies. When the wet tearing sound stopped, a deep, raspy voice spoke. "My king." Gwen turned around. Standing near the counter was a man nearly as tall as Gideon, though leaner. He was completely naked, his skin crisscrossed with pale, jagged scars. His left arm was hanging limply at his side, the shoulder clearly dislocated. "Torin," Gideon acknowledged, pulling the wool blanket over his waist and sitting up against the wall. "We lost the rear guard," Torin reported, his voice devoid of emotion. "The snow covered our tracks, but they are sweeping the valley. It is only a matter of time." Gwen sighed loudly, dragging a hand down her face. "Okay, stop." Torin snapped his head toward her, his eyes flashing yellow. "Mind your tone, Omega." Gwen picked up the heavy iron poker from the floor. She didn't raise it, just leaned on it like a walking stick, but the implication was clear. "I am going to say this exactly once. You are in my house. You are eating my air, bleeding on my wood, and tracking snow onto my floorboards. I don't care if you are the king of the north or a stray mutt. If you want to survive the night in this cabin, you will shift back into wolves. Human bodies lose heat too fast, and I only have 3 blankets." Torin bared his teeth, a low growl starting in his chest. He took a step toward her. "Torin." Gideon's voice was barely more than a whisper, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. The soldier froze. He looked back at his king. "She is right," Gideon said, his eyes never leaving. "Gwen, conserve your heat. Shift." Torin's jaw clenched, but he bowed his head. Within seconds, the sickening sound of bones breaking echoed again, and a large, scarred brown wolf stood in his place. Gwen let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She walked over to the hearth and threw another log on the fire. The flames leaped, casting long, dancing shadows against the log walls. She sat in her rocking chair, pulling her knees to her chest. 30 wolves. 1 wounded king wrapped in a blanket, and a blizzard that showed no signs of stopping. Gideon watched her from across the room. The firelight flickered over his pale, exhausted face. "You aren't like the Omegas in the capital," he noted quietly. "The Omegas in the capital are bred for politics and warming beds," Gwen replied, resting her chin on her knees. "I was bred for the cold. Why did you leave your pack?" "They wanted me to mate with a beta who liked to use his fists when he drank," Gwen said bluntly. She looked at the fire, listening to the sap hiss and pop. "I decided I preferred the company of trees." Gideon was quiet for a long time. The wind howled outside, a relentless, shrieking entity trying to tear the roof off. "They try to break kings, too," he said eventually. Gwen turned her head, looking at him. He was staring at his hands, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "The difference," Gwen said softly, "is that when a king breaks, a kingdom bleeds. When an Omega breaks, nobody even notices." Gideon looked up. Their eyes met across the small, crowded room. There was no pity in his gaze, no alpha arrogance, just a quiet, heavy understanding. "I notice," he said. By the morning of the 3rd day, the cabin had become a pressure cooker. The blizzard had raged without pause, burying the single window entirely in a wall of white snow. The only light came from the fire, which was dwindling rapidly. Gwen's indoor wood supply was gone. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping, the frost creeping back across the floorboards, from the door inward. The wolves were lethargic, curled into tight balls, conserving every ounce of energy. The smell of the crowded space was atrocious, a thick soup of sweat, wet fur, and the sharp tang of healing wounds. Gwen sat at her table, tracing the grain of the wood with a cracked fingernail. Her stomach gnawed at itself. They had eaten her winter supply of dried venison in a single day. She had rationed it, but 31 massive bodies required fuel. Now, there was nothing left but a half bag of oats and a jar of pickled roots. Gideon was leaning against the far wall, his eyes closed. He was still wrapped in her blanket, though his skin was no longer slick with fever sweat. His regenerative abilities were monstrous. The jagged tear in his side had closed into an ugly, puckered red scar. Gwen stood up. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. Every wolf in the room opened their eyes, tracking her movement. She walked to the door and pulled the iron bolt back. "What are you doing?" Gideon asked. He didn't open his eyes. "We are out of wood," Gwen said, grabbing her heavy wool coat from the peg on the wall. "My lean-to is around the back. If I don't get logs, we freeze." "You can't open that door," Gideon said, finally looking at her. "The snowdrift will be 5 feet high. It will collapse into the room." "Then I'll dig through it," Gwen snapped, her patience entirely frayed. The claustrophobia was making her skin itch. She was used to silence. She was used to space. Being trapped in a box with an overwhelming amount of alpha energy was fraying her nerves to a bloody pulp. She shoved the door outward. It moved an inch and hit a solid wall of packed snow. Gwen cursed under her breath. She shoved again, using her shoulder. Nothing. A shadow fell over her. Gideon stood right behind her. He had dropped the blanket. He was wearing Torin's pants, which the soldier had evidently shifted out of before transforming, and nothing else. The air around him practically vibrated with heat. "Move," he said quietly. Gwen stepped back. Gideon placed his hands flat against the heavy oak. He didn't shove. He simply planted his feet, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching into thick, knotted cords, and pushed. The wood groaned. The sound of shifting snow compacted against the exterior walls. With a loud cracked times of ice breaking, the door forced outward, carving a path through the massive drift. Blinding, brilliant light flooded into the dark cabin. Gwen squinted, throwing a hand up to shield her eyes. The wind was gone. The howling had stopped. The absolute, crystalline silence of the aftermath pressed against her ears. Beyond the threshold, the world was buried. The trees were heavy with white. The sky, a piercing, cloudless blue. Mutt. The air that rushed into the cabin was brutally cold, completely resetting the stifling atmosphere in seconds. Gideon stood in the doorway, the freezing air washing over his bare chest. He took a deep breath, his chest expanding, pulling in the scents of the forest. The pack behind them began to stir. Low whines of anticipation filled the room. The smell of the outside world meant movement. It meant survival. "The storm broke," Gwen said, stating the obvious. She wrapped her coat tighter around herself, her breath puffing in white clouds. Gideon turned to look at her. In the harsh daylight, he looked older. The silver scars crisscrossing his torso were stark against his pale skin. He looked like a king who had lost a war. "We have to move," he said. The gravel was back in his voice. The vulnerability of the dark cabin was gone. He was the sovereign again. "If the storm broke, my brother's hunting parties will be moving." "Good," Gwen said, walking past him to grab a log from the lean-to. She didn't look at him. She focused on the rough bark in her hands. "I'd like my house back." She carried the log inside and dropped it onto the dying embers of the hearth. Behind her, the sound of bones breaking filled the air one last time. When Gwen turned around, 30 men and women stood in her cabin. They were bruised, battered, and dressed in whatever torn rags they had managed to salvage before the ambush. But they stood in perfect military formation. Torin stepped forward. His shoulder was bruised, purple and yellow, but it was back in its socket. "My king, we can reach the northern peaks by nightfall. There are loyalist packs in the highlands." Gideon nodded slowly. He didn't look at his soldiers. He was looking at Gwen. She stood by the hearth, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets. She looked small against the backdrop of the heavily muscled warriors, but she didn't cower. She held her chin high, her expression guarded, indifferent. "Clear out," Gideon ordered his soldiers, his eyes locked on hers. "Wait for me, at the tree line." They filed out silently, slipping through the carved path in the snowdrift. In less than a minute, the cabin was empty, save for the two of them. The silence rushed back in, but it felt different now. It didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow. Gideon walked slowly across the room. He stopped inches from her. He was so tall, she had to tilt her head back to look at his face. The smell of him pine, Smoke and that crushing ozone was overwhelming, but Gwen didn't step back. He reached out. His hand, calloused and stained with dried blood, brushed against her cheek. His thumb traced the sharp line of her jaw. The touch was incredibly gentle for a man who could tear a throat out with his teeth. Gwen's breath hitched. She hated herself for it. The omega inside her, dormant and starved, purred at the contact, practically begging her to lean into his palm. She forced her body to remain entirely still, her eyes fixed on his. "You saved my life," Gideon said softly. "You bled on my floor," Gwen countered, her voice tight, trying to maintain the cynical armor that had kept her alive for 6 years. A small, genuine smile touched the corner of Gideon's mouth. It changed his entire face, softening the brutal angles. "I owe you a door," he said, looking over her shoulder at the splintered oak frame. "I owe you for the wood you chopped by opening it," she replied. "We're even." Gideon's eyes darkened. The gold flared, hot and possessive, just for a fraction of a second. "Kings do not do even, Gwen." He stepped back. The sudden absence of his heat made the freezing cabin feel 10 degrees colder. He walked toward the door, pausing on the threshold. He didn't look back. "When I take back my throne," Gideon said, his voice echoing in the dead quiet of the snow-covered forest, "I am coming back for my door. Try not to freeze before then." He stepped out into the glaring sunlight, his massive form quickly swallowed by the brilliant white of the snowdrifts. Gwen stood by the hearth for a long time. She listened until the crunching of 30 pairs of boots faded into nothingness. She was alone again. The silence she had craved for days was finally hers. She walked over to the table and picked up the bloody rag she had used to stitch his side. She stared at it. Her cynical mind told her he would die before he reached the highlands. It told her a king with no army was a dead man walking. It told her she was a fool to feel the sudden hollow ache in her chest. Gwen walked to the fireplace and threw the bloody rag into the flames. She watched it burn, the smell of scorched linen filling the air. She grabbed her heavy iron poker and began stoking the fire. She had to survive the winter. She had a door to fix. If you felt the chill of the blizzard and the heavy tension in that cabin, hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel to catch more stories of Gwen and Gideon. Will the Alpha King reclaim his throne? Or will the winter tear them apart forever? Drop a comment below with your predictions and share this video with someone who loves a dark, gritty romance.